Bengan bakarta, which is roasted eggplant. We call it eggplant. But there is 22 other ingredients that go into it. And then they are put over a fire in a particular sequence. And they end up blending such that you get the dish that you cherish. What our multiculturalism wants is for each ingredient to retain its identity. You don't get a dish. It's just a bunch of stuff on a plate in their original form. The form has to change, but not as a sacrifice. It is a process of enhancing the collective value. This is what we used to have, and it wasn't perfect, let me emphasize that, but it was still good enough. Now what has happened is, if one spice is too much in a recipe, then you're ruined.
It's complicated and it's multifactorial. I think part of the issue I have with multiculturalism is that my culture is being erased. I've seen evolve over the years is that this kind of obsession with diversity and with multiculturalism has led to a lot of disunity, increases in bigotry, racism, groups clashing in the streets against each other. I don't want this in my country. So I think people have to really elucidate why multiculturalism would be better than people assimilating and privately enjoying aspects of their country of origins culture. When I was growing up, that's basically what happened. The policy was official, but people who came really embraced Canadian culture publicly. And of course, they worshiped the way they wanted to worship. They did as they pleased. It isn't politically correct to say this, but it's true that in the past, our immigration policies were focused on bringing in people who were educated and who were from the upper classes of whichever country they came from. So even if people didn't have largely overlapping values, their behavior certainly would have been more aligned with Canadian behavior. All of my opinions are basically classical conservative opinions. There's nothing unusual or shocking about them. But the fact that people now are startled sometimes to hear classical conservative positions just shows how much the progressives have managed to leverage patronage over the years. It really is about the culture for me and people buying into the culture. So you don't have to be white to do that. And a lot of people who are the most nationalist and defending Canadian values are not white.
Very soon after Trudeau came to office, 2015, he did an interview with the New York Times in which he described Canada as the first post-national state with no core identity, no mainstream. And that was not just an illustrious turn of phrase. That was actually a declaration of what he intended to do as Prime Minister. And we're seeing the Christian symbols stripped from our coat of arms, plan to remove historic marching songs from the Navy in a attempt at pursuing inclusion. And you see the passports, all the historical imagery was removed, replaced with very generic, inclusive imagery in which everyone can feel that they are part of it.
We are a country traditionally of two solitudes overlaid with multiculturalism. What does that mean? We are English and French, who are the founding peoples of Canada. We are multicultural. In fact, I'm not talking about state-funded, but in fact, because we have layers of immigrants who've come from all over the world to live here together. And we have Indigenous people who were here when the French and English came, who are still here, and whom we still have not, I think, resolved fully that piece of how they integrate into the modern Canada, because the modern Canada is not going away. So we've had layers of different cultures for a very long time in this country, and that I call de facto multiculturalism. It just is multicultural. But then in the late 1960s, Canada had a lot of issues between the original two solitudes that had resulted in the creation of a separatist movement in Quebec. In fact, a terrorist organization called the Front de Libération du Québec. And in the 1960s, they wanted Quebec to separate. They were putting bombs in mailboxes. They kidnapped and killed a provincial cabinet minister. They were a real serious threat. And so the Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, cracked down on them. He brought in the War Measures Act. They were basically disbanded, but the political arm, the Parti Québécois, continued, and that became the focus of the separatist movement. And they went on to have two referendums in 1980 and 1995. But before we got there, what Trudeau did at the same time was he decided to dilute this pressure on the French and English, sort of to get away from the conversation that Canada was just two solitude. And the official Multiculturalism Act declared that Canada was not a country of French and English only, not just bilingual, but multicultural. And the government started throwing money at all sorts of groups in an effort to bolster their presence and their importance in the Canadian nation. It was also a way for the Liberals to get votes, quite honestly, because they were funding people, and when you fund people, they tend to like you. And the idea was to take the emphasis off the French-English duality. Instead of being just a factually multicultural society, we became a state multicultural society, state-funded. And what that did was to encourage people to celebrate their differences as opposed to what we had in common. And I don't think Trudeau could have necessarily foreseen this over time, but over time what it did was it made people hold on much more to the culture they left than to the culture they were going to.
When I was in high school, I had a friend of mine who was very, very certain that you have to play hockey or love hockey in order to be Canadian.
I associate being Canadian with being outdoors, with being robust, with being with physical strength, with a sense of adventure, with innovation. And I think that's another way that people are not integrating, because most immigrants come to cities, and so they don't have any sense of the rural experience.
We always tend to define a Canadian identity as something that is not American. That is very hard to define what that is because Canada generally is not necessarily a melting pot, whereas the US has always tried to maintain this identity. When new immigrants come in, it becomes a melting pot that everyone sort of just becomes an American.
Being a good Canadian means respecting other people, being kind to other people, and believing in fairness and equality. Those who think that the only people who are Canadians, real Canadians, are the ones that are born here, that's not true. That is definitely not true. A true Canadian, like I said, is someone who loves and supports this country, supports Canada, helps their community, and treats others with respect, no matter where they were born or where they came from.
I don't like the expression Canadian values because to me at least, it smacks of Canadian exceptionalism. What is crucial in the Canadian context is the person's ability to adopt the nuances of Canadian manners and mannerisms, which make it easier for people to blend together. That's what I understand by Canadian values. Sometimes they have to be hammered in.
A French Canadian, generally, they know who they are. Quebec has a very strong culture and a strong language. They're self-assured and they have a confidence in who they are as a people. English Canadians have a weak sense of identity, and it has been the results of a long process of systematic dismantling of our identity at the hands of the federal government. And I would trace that right back to Pierre Trudeau's imposition of multiculturalism.
There are a few sayings we have in Canada, and one is the true north, strong and free. We are a country of wilderness. We are a country of cold. We are a country of extreme climate situations, the beautiful Arctic, the majestic forests and mountains. Geography is a big part of who we are, and the sense of vastness and space that Canada is. And then we go to strong. we are a country of strength. This is something that we have been proud of our pioneers who carved a country from essentially the wilderness and built cities, built railroads, built the beautiful infrastructure as well. And then finally free. We are a country where people sought freedom. We never really separated from the monarchy, but we sought freedom from the control of a social control that we experienced in places that we left. Think of Ukrainian immigrants who came here, people from Russia, people from post-war Europe, people who were fleeing places that they were not free, where tyranny had reigned. They seek that freedom here to be themselves. That doesn't mean bringing to me your problems with you. It means being able to shrug them off and to say, I'm in a better place. We were not a revolutionary society. We have freedom to use firearms if you're a hunter and whatnot, but we don't celebrate gun culture the way they do in the US. And to me, that is a defining difference.
Canadians will hearken back and say everything was great prior to Trudeau, but even in the 1980s, we could see the seeds that had already been planted. There was the Air India bombing, and there was evidence that our politicians were not deporting dangerous elements that India had identified as already being in Canada. And then we have the example of Marc Le Pen, whose name was actually Gamil Garbi, who was the son of a French-Canadian woman and an Algerian wife-beater. He was trotted out as being an example of Canadian misogyny. But when you look at the story, really he was raised by someone from a culture that didn't value women, and he was badly beaten from the time he was little, and that was completely covered over by the press. People like to whitewash the history, and in whitewashing the history, you're not able to contend with the problems. And without contending with problems, you can't solve problems.
I was born in Punjab, India. I've been here for about 52 years now. Canada has changed, I like to say, for the better. A lot of people may not agree with me. When we came, I remember one incident. My grandpa came to visit us in 1977 for the first time. I believe it was Deepavali, or I think Guru Nanak Jayanti. And I remember my grandpa plugging in the Christmas lights to celebrate. We had some people come in and throw eggs at our windows. I saw a lot of discrimination when I was growing up. Because they hadn't seen brown people, never seen turban people before in their life. Once we told them where we came from, why we have long hair or why we were turban, they readily accepted us.
Even when I was a teenager in the 90s, I was followed by Arabic Muslim men in their 20s. One of my bosses, when I was waitressing, I was 19, I caught him watching me change because the door didn't close properly. He was an Egyptian Muslim. That was in the 90s. The problems were already here, but we weren't addressing them. And in fairness, we had to call the police when my friend and I were followed by the men. This is making a very long story short, but they said to them, we don't do that here. You don't follow teenage girls around. If you even look at them again, we'll send you back. That's what the police said in the 90s with people who weren't adapting. And that's what should be said.
My father left the island of Trinidad and they came to Canada in 1972. And he didn't have anyone here. His only family was his brother had come to do school. And when they came, they had nothing, like literally nothing. He just had the money in his pocket. He didn't even have a pillow to sleep on. He had one of those old phone books. My father told me a story on one of his job interviews that he went for. There was an ad that appeared in the newspaper. He called and he spoke to the manager. The manager said, yes, the job is available. When he goes there, within 20 minutes, the manager looks at him and says, the position has been filled. My dad told me afterwards that it was because he saw who he was that he didn't want to give him the job. So when I think of that and all the things that were done to make Canada a more welcoming place, and the work that was done by those that came to kind of fight through all of these barriers to make themselves known in this society, to have all of that sort of come crashing down now because of the rise of immigration, it's almost like it's come full circle again. How is it that you've made so much progress on one side to only have it drop right back down?
When I was at university, They did have massive protests at least a few times a year. The student association was already kind of filled with pro-terrorist elements. The foreign students that were coming in were dangerous individuals, and some of them were coming from powerful families in Syria and other locations, and they ended up infiltrating into our institutions. Universities really are kind of ground zero for the worst ideas that are taking over.
I'm a big fan of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. I think we're all here, all the immigrants, because of Pierre Elliott Trudeau. He was the one who opened the doors in early 1970s for the immigrants to come in. He was the one who let the Syrians in. He was the one who let the boat people in. He was the one who let the refugees come in. So Canada has always believed in asylum, refugee system, but genuine people. When we talk about Canada and talking about Mr. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, now a lot of people might not agree with me. When I go back to India, I talk about Canada very proudly. What we stand as Canadians. There is no other country in the world that even comes close to Canada. What our Charter of Rights is. Other countries want to copy us. They want to be like Canada. Now, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when he wrote the Charter of Rights, we didn't just talk about it, we implemented it. Show me one country that even comes close to Canada's Charter of Rights.
In 1982, when Trudeau brought in the Charter of Rights, that's a civil law charter. It's not a common law charter. So we ended up with kind of a mishmash. And then we also have the human rights codes, which are a disaster. So between these different changes in the law, and then stacking the courts. People need to understand the courts are stacked with progressive judges. Like over 90% of them are progressives. The Senate is stacked with progressives. So from a legal standpoint, if they make a good decision, it's an accident. The common law principles were thrown out the window. These are activist judges who are rewriting the law and exploiting the weaknesses in the system.
My family are immigrants, so I was the first to be born in Canada. My parents worked hard, they assimilated here, and it's never really been an issue. I grew up in a north part of Etobicoke, which there has always been a large Indian population there, demographic, especially on the Albion area, and we all got along great. Race was never an issue. I could honestly say growing up in the 80s and 90s, I've never paid attention to anyone's race or religion. It's just, we were all people just trying to get by, and we were playing kind of nice in the sandbox.
My wife came in 2013. At that time, international students, they couldn't even work off campus for the first 6 months. International education was something that you had to afford without being able to work in Canada. It was a tough nut to crack. Every immigrant goes through that. Let me set the record straight here. Just because Canada issued study permits, and eventually the students qualified for postgraduate work permits and or closed work permits and so on, there was never an obligation that you would get the permanent residence. That was the self-imposed pressure, whether because of societal pressure, financial pressure, whatever it is. But the fact is, permanent residence was always a privilege. It wasn't a right.
Canadian culture of the past really doesn't exist anymore except in dinosaurs like myself. My entire framework for Canada as well is Christian, and I think that that's really being lost in translation, especially with multiculturalism, because it was baked into our constitution. I think as we've moved away from the Christian underpinnings of Canada, we've also culturally moved away from Judeo-Christian values, which is really showing in some of the weird woke Marxism.
Canadian politics is just so slow to react. It's so slow to do anything. It's the Canadian way of doing things, slow. It's not data-driven either. So Harper, our previous prime minister, has put on visa requirements for Mexicans to come into Canada. Justin Trudeau went on one of those world events. He came back and they removed visa requirements for Mexico. the reason we put on visa requirements for Mexicans into Canada is because our asylum claims in Canada was mostly driven by Mexican for years. Before the pandemic, at some point there, he removed the visa requirements, and that led to floodgates of Mexicans coming here and declaring asylum. And that also brought in the human trafficking industry up here and cartels. They very quickly for Canadian politics, it took a few years, but they reinstated the visa because of US demands, because of how much crime and human trafficking we saw coming over the northern border. So fast forward to later, coming out of the pandemic, the Liberal government has decided to mass immigrate people. They said on 2 different times that the mass immigration, aka bringing consumers, has helped avoid 2 recessions in the last 3 years, which really in itself just shows how alarming the state of our economy is, but also how short-sighted it is.
I think it was in January 2023 when realized that if you strip out inflation, the per capita growth in our GDP was over a period of 10 years, it was at 0.67%. And 6 months later, OECD came out with the same figure basically. It was 0.80% instead of 0.67%. And at that time, my conclusion was that for the next generation, the prospects of a bright future have been destroyed.
Birth rates in developed countries are dropping. And to maintain the sustainability of those societies, immigration is certainly needed. The level of immigration, I think, is always a warranted question. Finding that balance of how is it we talk about these things without seemingly being anti-immigration? Because I certainly don't want to be viewed as someone who is anti-immigration, because I am the product of immigration. And we have seen what has happened in the US with the whole H-1B visa and the type of negativity that arose out of that. And US wouldn't be where it is right now if it wasn't for immigrants. I think every country has to weigh the pros and cons of immigration.
One of the reasons or arguments for immigration into Canada and the Western world in general is that we have an aging population. The difference is we don't need mass immigrants to work in factories. We have robots that are going to be doing all those jobs. So we need higher level of immigration to do advanced jobs, because the bottom level of society is going to get innovated out. They're going to become obsolete. Right now, Canada has millions of people that do entry-level jobs as a career. So we need to think about what are we going to do with millions of people that we keep adding on to as their job pool shrinks. And that's where the conversations around UBI comes in. So designing our society and our economy is now more important than ever because of the speed of innovation.
My argument is more about culture, because we're not just a wallet where people come in and they can make a lot of money and do whatever they want. Canadian politicians should be aiming for a concept of Canadian identity and a national identity. It's a country after all. And that means talking about culture. It's actually disgusting that they show up at these various events, like the phonies they are, put on a costume and pretend to be going through the motions with something that has no meaning to them whatsoever. People need to stop thinking that they're incompetent or clueless. They know exactly what they're doing. There's a lot of divide and conquer going on.
did see an attempt by the Trudeau government to roll out a mass amnesty under Immigration Minister Mark Miller, and he basically publicly admitted at one point that he had backtracked on that because he had floated it to the cabinet table of Liberals, and they had said, look, that is too far. Canadians are not going to go for that. So we do have to be vigilant about ensuring that these visas expire and the people leave.
And when you bring in millions of unskilled labor, we just do not invest in productivity and innovation. Our public sector job growth outpaced private sector job growth by multiples. So the private sector is not attracting investment because of that policy to begin with. So they're stuck at jobs like Tim Hortons, whatever, all the jobs, low-skilled jobs that are going to be automated out within the next 10 years anyways.
I was talking to a bunch of students at University of Toronto. They were also international students, most from India. We ended up talking about the movie Terminator 3. These were all computer engineering students, so they got into a heavy discussion about whether Skynet can actually be self-aware. And their ideas may be workable, may not be workable, but they were able to think along those lines, and they knew what the baseline was, which was the movie. That means they had that level of exposure to Western culture. You see, other international students from India, they have no exposure to it, number one. Number two, their interests are confined to the area where they come from, whether it is Punjab or Haryana or Gujarat or Kerala or wherever, in the place of origin. So that has to change. We have to start insisting that there are certain ways of behavior here and you will have to change yourself, at least when you are in public. We are not doing that for whatever reason. Maybe people don't want to be called racist.
Canada has always helped refugees. A lot of these people are not genuine refugees, but it's very important to find a fair way to help those genuinely in need. The government has to make sure that there are enough jobs, there's enough housing for people, there's good health care for everyone. Now, sometimes I find that the new immigrants, they find it hard to get the jobs or places to live. They might not have the Canadian experience as required by the companies. And I've seen a lot of professionals like the doctors or the engineers or the lawyers having to drive a rideshare, driving for rideshare companies or taxi industry. So that's kind of sad to see. When we come to Canada, we have to take the responsibility. We have to follow the laws and the rules. We have to adapt to the country that's adopting us.
We as a community have a responsibility to any families that are coming here that want to celebrate local mandirs, local cultural groups, have a responsibility to creating outreach programs. What is it that I need to do to integrate?
Because it doesn't mean losing every aspect of your culture. It doesn't mean not celebrating your festival and having special meals or traditions or things of that nature. But it means being able to participate fully in the life of the country in all its aspects and understand how to be a Canadian.
Being Canadian is a matter of the heart. You might have a Canadian citizenship, but if you are just en route to the United States, are you truly committed? And for that matter, if you live in a ethnic enclave and have not made an attempt to assimilate and to integrate yourself into the wider society, one of the benefits of a cohesive, high-trust society where immigration is kept low and at a sustainable number, where assimilation is encouraged, is that people actually do think of themselves as individuals, rather than as part of an enclave, as part of a vote bank.
It's important that you yourself find your positions in this society where you can equally straddle both worlds, because Canada is a great place to live in. That we take these Canadian values and we hold on to our traditional values and we show it to the new immigrants that are coming in.
What damage has been caused to Canadians and to the country. and to me specifically, who was otherwise seen as a model minority. But because they ran amok with their immigration policy, I have to proactively go out of my way and say, hey, I'm not like that.
People assume that we have reached the end of the road and we are not going to get the PR. So let's look at the options of getting married, getting LMIA, humanitarian and asylum cases. I do not concur with that. You're alienating the whole diaspora, and a lot of you are being exploited at workplace, work on cash at lower wages. We're going to cram multiples of you in basements because you can't afford to pay higher rent and so on. Even if you got permanent residence like this, or even if you are able to extend your stay in Canada, what's that getting you in the long run? The whole idea of coming to Canada was to have a better life. Just because there is CN Tower or Niagara Falls is in the background, that does not make your life any more worth it.
We need help. Visas expire, they need to go home. We just don't have the space. We don't have the infrastructure for them. We don't have the resources. People need to get deported. People need to leave Canada. And then we need to have stricter rules on rentals. And I need the provincial government at that level to stop with the basement apartments and garden suites.
So the system became so rife with malfeasance, outright corruption, fraud, that in my opinion, it has to be completely scrapped and the new one has to be built from scratch. But that requires an amount of political courage that is rare to find. Not an easy task to do. Because you don't want this to cause even more social unrest than already exists. That is the only way we can bring about a semblance of balance between the level of population and the economic and physical demands that level of population puts on the system. That is the only way forward. The best we can do if we go out on a war footing would be to recover in one generation's time.
We need to be competitive for that. The problem is we're not. The smart people that do come here, we are a stopover for the United States because we are so overtaxed and red taped, and the opportunities are across the border. So we need to retain those people.
We need to build parallel systems that reward conservatives the same way that progressives do. They've managed to take over all of the institutions. They managed to take over the managerial positions in corporations and enforce their will on Canadians. We need to have a similar patronage.
Harsh but simple way to fix it would be remove the ability for international students to work off campus, and also remove postgraduate work permits. And a third reform you could mix in with that would be to restore the Harper era rule of preventing international students from counting their study time towards their physical residency requirement. And there is a very, very simple way to handle the housing crisis, which could be done in a matter of moments with the stroke of a pen. The immigration minister is to moderate the growth of the population through immigration. The amount of time and energy we spend talking around these problems. And I think that's mainly because of political correctness and a fear of being labeled racist.
Every single one of those people that came here illegally, essentially, or under false pretenses, has to be deported. There is no other way around it. And there's a whole system to cater to them. And the government must go after that system, because they will pivot and they will turn and they'll find the next loophole. It should be the same day deportation.
Our politicians actually have to advocate nationalism. I don't think they should be allowed to go to temples and churches. I mean, they don't go to churches very often. to pander, but I don't think they should be permitted to do that. I am not anonymous on X. I put my face next to my ideas because I want to encourage other people to be bold and to have conversations with people in their lives. What kind of country are you planning to leave to your children?
Canada needs to start having self-respect, and we need to start acting like it. And we need to start acting like a sovereign nation that's not going to be rolling over for every single reason, every single buzzword, and every single one.
Stop according greater importance to the immigration status of a temporary resident compared to the need to provide safety to Canadians. I have seen the courts making an error in this. I don't know how you change that because the law is in place. It is at the discretion of the judges.
The complete moratorium on immigration. It has to happen for a long period of time. We have approximately 5 million people who have expiring paperwork who need to return to their countries of origin. We need to withdraw from a lot of international organizations. People don't understand that governmental organizations are driving Canadian policy. So the UN Compact on Migration has obligated Canada to receive hundreds of thousands to over 1 million people who otherwise would not be brought into the country. These organizations didn't have control over our sovereignty and our politicians' decision-making. The UN Agenda 2030, if people go into the Sustainable Development Goals, they all seem kind of vague and hopey and changey and all right. But what they don't realize is that they have a direct influence on corporations and on the government and actual concrete policy. DEI is coming out of that. So we need to get out of the UN. We need to get out of the WHO. We need to shut down these fake charities that are funneling money to terrorist organizations. We need to take on organized crime.
One of the beauties that Canada had for years is we're not hyphenated. We don't have Black Canadians. We just have Canadians. We don't have Indo-Canadians. We just have Canadians. And one of the unfortunate things that will happen in Canada is if we move towards that differentiation. I find that's a true separation of our society. The future and the unity of our country is dependent on it.
There are touchstones that we have as a country that people share in. And when you share in that, you feel there's a commonality. The one good thing about the threats we're facing is that maybe finally they'll wake us up to get together and hang together. That we define our culture and we be proud to be Canadian and we stand up and say, no, we have something worth fighting for and defending, and discovered what that is together.
If everything and anything is Canadian, then being Canadian means nothing.
As they say, demographics is destiny, and we need to figure out what the destiny is.
Come here with the right reasons, right motivations, and be adaptable. If it doesn't happen, it's not the end of the world.
This whole ecosystem of migration and the governmental ministry around it needs to be audited. Every single one of them, every single communication, every single MP, everything needs to be audited. And I think for this government, they should have a ministry of deportation.
We have to move away from this constant emphasis on difference and find something more in common and tell people when they come here, like my parents were told, you want to be Canadian, and what does that mean? And that's what you should aspire to.